So this Shabbos is going to be Tu B'Shvat.
Yeah.
Mishnah tells us, Mishnah beginning of Maseches Rosh Hashanah, tells us Arba Rosh Hashanah, there are four days of the year that are designated as Rosh Hashanah. Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah Lamlachim v'Aragogin. The first day of Nisan is the new year for counting, dating the kings, for the cycle of the holidays. Begins, of course, with Pesach. Be'echad be'Elul Rosh Hashanah L'Meiser Behema. The first day of Elul is the new year for the annual tithe of the flax. It has to be given from 1 year, so that year again starts in Elul. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Be'echad b'Tishrei, they say no, that actually happens on the first day of Tishrei. Be'echad b'Tishrei, first day of Tishrei, what we call Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah L'Shanim, that's the beginning of the year, the counting of the different years for Meiser purposes, L'Shmitin, V'la Yevleis, V'la Natia, V'la Yerakos, and then also all the countings that are done for the Shemitah year, for the Yovel year, all those cycles of the years for planting to determine how many years the plant has grown for, and for Meiser, that's taking the tithes that are taken from vegetables. Be'echad b'Shvat, on the first day of Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan. That is the new year for trees. Kedivrei Beis Shammai, according to the opinion of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel Oimrim b'Chamisha Asur Bar. Beis Hillel tells us, and this is how the halacha follows the opinion of Beis Hillel, that the new year for trees is on Tu B'Shvat. So what exactly does it mean, the new year for trees? We know that in the land of Israel there are tithes, Truma and Meiser, that has to be taken from each fruits that are grown there. And again, we have different years in the Meiser cycle require different Meisers to be taken. The first 2 years we take Meiser Sheni, the third year we take Meiser Ani, a different tithe that's given to the poor. And therefore we see that...
Could you define Meiser for us?
So Meiser is a tithe. 1/10 of the produce of something that's grown in Israel has to be taken and used for specific holy purposes. We have within the standard order of donations that are taken, there would be first taken a donation called Truma. This was a tithe that was given to the Kohen, it was given to a priest. Not we use the word tithe in English for it, but it was not a tenth. It was about a 50th of the produce. You could give a 40th if you wanted, a 60th if you wanted. This would be given to the priest. Then you'd have another tithe. This was an actual tithe, actual tenth of the land. That was given to the Levium. Then the third tithe would be another. This was again another 10% of what's left. And this one is going to differ between what year we're talking about. Are we talking about a year, the years 1, 2, 4, and 5 in the Shemitah cycle of 7 years? Those will be eaten in Jerusalem by the owners. In years 3 and 6 of the Shemitah cycle, that's going to be given to the poor. So these tithes, and of course during Shemitah, during the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, there are no tithes that are taken because the land is ownerless. Anyone, Kohanim, Leviim, Aniyim, anyone who wants can go ahead and take from this food. They're all equal in eating the food, so there are no tithes that are given in the Shemitah. So therefore we have to know what year are we talking about.
How is this... how is this implemented practically nowadays?
This will be done in Israel. If you go and want to buy produce in Israel, you need to make sure you're getting produce from some organization that has taken off Truma and Meiser. The chief rabbinate supervises a lot of the...
And so what do they do with those portions nowadays?
So nowadays, the portions that are supposed to be given to the Kohen and Levi, to the priests, are not eaten by the Kohanim. The Kohanim are not able to eat Truma. We don't have the requisite levels of purity that are needed to eat Truma. So those produce are actually destroyed. And but some of the other some of these various gifts can be given to the poor, but the ones the truma itself has to be destroyed. And then there are procedures that were set up for when you're not sure. We don't know if there is anything here that is requires the requires separation of ties. There's a procedure for taking. Still, a small portion of the produce will have to be taken off. This applies all the way to Israeli produce. But even when buying produce in the United States, if you talk about Israeli produce, fresh produce that does not have any rabbinical supervision, you need to find out what needs to be done. It could be that some sort of demai, some sort of unknown status applies to this produce, and that someone would need to take off, let's say, buy fresh Jaffa oranges or something like that. To find out what, if anything, something might need to be done to separate these ties.
So there's an obligation even for us living outside of Israel,
yes,
if we buy Israeli produce to make sure that it was
canned produce and stuff like that, which has a hechsher on it, that will have been taken care of before the produce.
But only obviously, since it's not a requirement for outside of Israel, then it just doesn't.
Exactly.
Any fruit
so produce, you grow something in your backyard, there's not going to be a requirement of truma and maser. These tithes do not need to be given. So this is from produce that is grown in the land of Israel.
How about orla for people who are outside of Israel?
So orla does apply. So if you plant a new tree, you plant a new fruit tree in your house, your backyard, or whatever. So there are going to be halachos that do apply to that. The halach of orla. Orla applies to the first 3 years that the tree is planted.
Just for the other people, if you could define orla.
Orla is the produce of the first 3 years of a tree's life. Mm-hmm. That produce cannot be eaten. Produce that's in the 4th year, also in the time of the temple, it could be redeemed or brought to Jerusalem to eat, but cannot otherwise be eaten outside of.
But that also only applies to fruits grown in Israel.
Orla applies to fruits grown even outside of Israel. So someone has a newly planted fruit tree. Oftentimes it's not going to produce so much fruit within the first 3 years anyway. But if it does, that fruit cannot be eaten.
Who does it apply to outside?
Would apply to Jews
grown now. Is there any issue with us purchasing fruit, for example, from Giant? Plain, fruit that hasn't been.
Generally speaking, fruit that's grown within the first 3 years, nobody uses it. It's not that good. You get to later on, the fruit gets better, and we can assume, presumably, that something that's you go to a supermarket and see produce there, you can assume that's not real. If you happen to know, something did come from a really new tree, your neighbor just planted a tree and it's.
Right.
You can't, really go see that, go take it yourself. You can't go take that for yourself, and that would be probably a situation to.
But so there's generally not a concern then buying fruit outside of the kosher fruit market,
exactly.
for example.
Generally not a concern, except unless you're a farmer or involved with something that you're planting yourself. In that case, you really should be in touch with a rabbi about the specific details of orla.
Yeah.
Isn't there a huge economic impact in Israel from
it's not that large. We end up taking because we're going to end up destroying. We take a relatively small amount of the produce. But this is part of the way to ensure that the food that's being eaten is kosher, and that one of the things which we're taught is that the proper observance of the laws of truma and maser, of taking portions of our crops and donating them to the Kohanim and Leviim, or if nowadays we can't actually give it to them to eat, but destroying that will provide blessing to the rest of the crops.
And Shemitah and Yavol is still observed in Israel?
Shemitah is observed. Shemitah is once every 7 years. The land is supposed to lie fallow. No work is done on Jewish-owned land. Land owned by non-Jews can be worked, but Jewish-owned land has to be left fallow. And the land and the produce of the land, like we said, the produce of the land is supposed to be made available for everyone to enjoy, to everyone to eat. Anyone, poor people can come into the fields and take what they want. This land,
whatever's
growing on its own, but that won't be made available to everyone on all. And therefore, during the Shemitah year, you have the concern obviously to make sure that the produce is was not farmed improperly during the Shemitah year, but you do not have to separate any type of tithes for during the Shemitah.
What about Yovel?
Yovel does not apply nowadays. Yovel is the Jubilee year, which was kept after seven cycles of the 7-year cycle. So the 50th year, the 50th year in this cycle was going to be kept as another year where the land lies fallow, and this year also has other specific laws associated with it. The Jewish slaves are set free. All ancestral land in Israel returns to its original owner. And this law only applied during the time of the first temple, really, when all of Israel, all of the Jewish people lived in Israel, at least the majority of the Jewish people in their tribes lived in Israel, and they knew where the ancestral homeland was. For each tribe had its own land, each family had its own land. And nowadays, even in the time of the Second Temple, when the majority of Jews no longer lived in Israel, the sages no longer kept the counts that were necessary to keep the Jubilee year, because you could not fulfill all of the laws of the Jubilee year.
So, just so I understand correctly, so you would have essentially a Shemitah year on the 7th cycle, and then the following year you would have the Yovel year.
This is what
so it would actually be 2 years in a row.
This is what, of course, the Torah famously says. You will ask, what are we going to eat after keeping 2 years of no work? And Hashem says that He will send His blessing to produce within that the 6th year, the 48th year, to produce a crop that will last for 3 years, for the 49th year, the 50th year, and then into the next year. And
so that's it. I mean, so that's just lots and lots of harvest of hay, and things like that.
I guess you can. I mean, one could bring in produce again from outside of Israel. One could eat, stored produce from beforehand. One could eat. And even non-Jewish owned land within Israel, according to most opinions, that could be worked by non-Jews and then purchased from them.
Just to throw a wrench in there, what about the Omer offering during Shemitah and?
So they would actually have this was one
because that was supposed to be from that year.
The temple would from the money that was given to the temple treasury. One of the functions that was done is they would actually send out messengers to find somewhere in the land that there was grain. So some grain will still grow even from the previous crop. So they will find some barley or some wheat, again, grew naturally, and they would have then people guard that to make sure no one took it until they could bring that for the offering. Again, the Omer offering, it's brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, that has to be brought from the new barley crop in Israel. And the Shtei Halachem, the offering that's brought 2 loaves of wheat bread that's brought on Shavuos, also has to be brought from produce of the land of Israel. So you got to make sure you can get that. So they would have, that was actually one of the things that was paid for from the temple funds, was to make sure that they would find somewhere where this stuff is growing wild or uncultivated, and then just make sure you can bring that for the offerings during the Shemitah and Yovel year.
Can you say just a few words about the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, in regards to Otzar Bet Din? What they do today?
So what they do today is, in order to, there's a lot of food that goes, how are people in Israel going to the right food? So like I said before, one thing which is possible is bringing food in from outside of Israel. One thing which is possible is having land that's cultivated by Gentiles, and that the chief rabbinate sells the whole land of Israel to a non-Jew to make that all the land should be considered land owned by non-Jews. A lot of people don't want to rely on that because really you are still having Jewish farmers doing work, but it could be a helpful thing which they do.
So, for example, if you have a grape juice that someone used,
exactly. So the more common thing which is done is something called Otzar Beit Din, and this is based on a practice that was done in the time of the Talmud, that, again, you can't individually harvest or buy and sell produce during the Shemitah year. It doesn't belong to you individually, it belongs to the community. But perhaps the Beit Din, perhaps the court, the Jewish community as a whole, can somehow control the Shemitah produce. And therefore, if they would take all the farms in the city, let's say, would get together and say, I'm not harvesting my farm, you're not harvesting your farm, it's just being done collectively, and to produce collective produce for the benefit of the city, the benefit of the community. So then there is still going to be money changing hands, but it's not per se to buy and sell these fruits. It doesn't belong to me, it doesn't belong to you. It's just a kind of communal property, and we're putting some money in towards the community and taking out in exchange for the food. It's not, again, not technically buying and selling, and certainly not in an individual sense, of someone individually working the land and producing produce himself. So now you do have, sometimes this comes up especially with wines, that will be labeled that they're part of Otzar Beit Din wine. This wine is permitted to be bought and sold because of this kind of loophole scenario, but the wine is considered to have what's called Kedushas Shvius, the sanctity that devolves on fruit that is grown in the 7th year in Israel. That fruit has certain laws which govern how it can be eaten. For instance, you have to eat it. You can't throw it out. You can't, spill it around. I don't know. People like, pop the champagne and let the wine spill. You can't do that. Wine from Shemitah, or even they talk about you can spill over some wine for Havdalah. Really should not be done. With Shemitah, wine needs to be drunk. So that's what Shemitah wine is.
So you can use that Shemitah wine for Pesach either.
For Pesach, for the second cup, when you're going to be spilling out wine, again, wine should not be used for that.
And it should not be used for Havdalah.
And if you do use it for Havdalah, you should not overfill the cup. You'll figure out some other way to put out the candle, but the wine needs to be drunk. That's one example of the
but it is acceptable for any sanctification purposes. I mean, you can make kiddush with it. It's okay.
Yeah, you can drink it. You're supposed to drink it.
And you can make kiddush over it. It's okay. Yeah.
Exactly. The other thing which is going to apply to this type of wine now is a halacha called beer. So Shemitah produce, like I said, it has to be made available to everyone. And let's say, I've gathered a lot of produce, you've gathered a lot of produce. At some point in time, you're not supposed to be making, storehouses of this grain. It's supposed to be, again, used for eating in a fair and equal way. Therefore, at the time of beer, which is literally the time of destruction, the time at which there is no more grain or wine, let's say wine for instance, there are no more grapes out in the field. So now all the grapes, all the wine that's been stored up has to be taken out of the house. You have there are opinions, which is not followed in halacha, as is practice nowadays, there are opinions that food literally needs to be destroyed. Cannot be used. The accepted opinion in the halakha is that the food needs to be taken out of the house. So once the grapes are no longer available in the field, anyone walking through vineyards in Israel cannot find Shemitah grapes anymore, which is certainly the case now. If you have wine, last Shemitah I think was 5 years ago now. So you don't have wine. There's no more Shemitah grapes out of the field. So if you are in possession of wine, you need to take that out of your possession. Take that bottle of wine. Now I bought a bottle of wine. It says it's Otzar Beit Din Shemitah wine. So what I do, I take that wine, I bring it, to a public location, and I say this wine is ownerless. Like we say on Erev Pesach, all the grain I own should be ownerless. That's with beer chametz that we destroy, that we take that out of our possession. And that's the same thing you have to do with the Shemitah food. And there are dates when they publish in Israel calendars at which time these foods need to be taken out of the house. They need to be declared to be ownerless. And if nobody else wants to take it, you can take it back. But it needs to again be put out there to be ownerless and available for everyone.
Because no more is being produced.
Exactly, no more is being produced. So now we say, well, is there still food? This food is supposed to be made available to everyone. So I gathered in everything that there was on this tree. So now what? It's still not made available to everyone. So now I'm going to have to again take that out and give people the opportunity if they want to. I once did this. I bought a bottle with that. I hadn't noticed on the label it was Otzar Beit Din. I took it to Shul and I put it out there and said, this is Hefker, this is ownerless. And after Shul, it was still there because nobody else wanted it. So I took it back. Someone could have taken it if they wanted to. I took it back and. You have to be careful. Make sure you drink the wine. And, it's most commonly found outside of Israel with wine. There's most other produce that's even Israeli produce doesn't seem to be getting out of Israel with
But it would be
Otzar.
labeled.
It would be labeled. It would be labeled, and it would say specifically, it would say it's Otzar Beit Din, it would Shemitah produce. Then not everything that's produced during Shemitah is going to be Otzar Beit Din. Something that's produced during Shemitah from Gentile-owned property has no sanctity. It's just regular food. You can eat it, you can spill it over the plate, you can do whatever you want with it. You can you can buy and sell, you can keep it. Again, it's not going to be subject to this sanctity of Shemitah. And Shemitah, you know what next Shemitah year is it's coming up. It's I think this is the 5th year of the Shemitah cycle. So yes, it should be it should be Tufshin Ein Hey, I think.
57.
57.
Yeah.
75.
75. Tufshin Ein Hey. So
Tough to be a farmer.
we talk about Tu B'Shvat though. So as we're talking about these halachas, we see that they're not so common for us outside of Israel. These are mostly Israel-specific halachot. That again, we now, especially with modern transportation of food, we often see the opportunity to get Israeli produce, but the actual laws are mostly connected to Israeli circumstances.
Practical question.
Yeah.
With Israel being so secular,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there's lots and lots of Jewish farmers, especially in the kibbutzim and all that, of course.
Yeah.
But so all these Jewish farmers that own private land, do they all go by that?
So this is what I was saying for it. So the chief rabbinate. I kind of glossed over it. What the chief rabbinate does every year, every Shemitah year, is they will sell technically under Israeli land law, even private farms are owned. Technically, the land is owned by the state.
Okay.
You are technically renting the land in perpetuity or the 99-year lease or something like that from the state, but the actual land under as the land laws goes back to Ottoman times, the land is owned technically by the state of Israel. Mm-hmm. So the state, through the chief rabbinate, will actually sell all of the land to an Arab or some non-Jewish person. So now a non-Jew, usually a member of Knesset, they make a ceremony out of it. But this is now technically someone who is non-Jewish is the owner of all of the land. And therefore, even if people are not going to necessarily be observing all of the laws which it's supposed to do, like we said before, land that's owned by a Gentile is not subject to the laws of Shemitah, because again, Gentiles don't have to keep this. So now all of the land, so produce which is going to then be produced from the land that's worked, even if it's worked by Jewish farmers, not the way it should be done during Shemitah, it's not going to be as bad of a problem. Might not be the best thing to rely on, but this is what they do to try and make sure that the produce coming out of Israel.
Do those Jewish farmers get some? I mean, it's almost like our agricultural laws. Do they get some farms? Do they get a subsidy or something?
So there are organizations that do try to raise money to support people who will be devoting themselves to Shemitah observance. Then they don't probably be as we're coming up to Shemitah. They often have appeals to support farmers who really will be keeping these laws, and then also even to go into the next year, they're not going to be starting late with the plowing and so on in the next year. So that is it's a very worthy cause to help farmers who do. I know through Aguda they have funds, and through other organizations they have funds to help support these farmers who do keep the laws of Shemitah and are not really not going to be working at all on their major produce. So some people try to do part-time things or diversify. You have a farm. I don't know. Maybe you can make some dairy farm. I don't know, something that's not involved with the land. But yeah, it really is. It is a financial hardship for many of these people. The Talmud says there's a verse in Tehillim. It talks about blessed are the Gibodei Koach Osim Ritzona, the people who are valiant spirited, who do what Hashem tells them to do, and that the Gemara explains is referring to people farmers who observe the laws of Shemitah, which is they are really being very very valiant in this observance that is a difficult thing to do. So when it comes to Tu B'Shvat, outside of Israel, when we don't have all of these agricultural laws which are going to be practically affected by Shemitah, which meiser am I giving now, which tithes am I going to be donating? Is this fruit that grew, is it subject to Shemitah laws or not? And that's going to change from Tu B'Shvat to Tu B'Shvat for tree fruit. But we do have a custom, we do observe it as a special day. It's listed together with other days which we call Rosh Hashanah, which we call New Year's. All of those days are special days. They fall on Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Hashanah itself is obviously a holiday. And based on this, there is a principle that Tu B'Shvat should be a day, obviously this year falls on Shabbos, but even when it falls on a weekday, Tu B'Shvat should be a day on which it is prohibited to fast. We don't say Tachanan on Tu B'Shvat. When it falls on Shabbos, we don't say Afarachim, and we don't say Tzidkas, like we do on a festive occasion. And there is a custom specifically to eat fruit, to eat tree fruit, to eat fruit of the land of Israel, to eat fruit of the 7 species by which the land of Israel is praised, and to pray for a good crop, to pray for all the different things. We have so many mitzvahs that we do revolve around food and produce. We revolve around. We have matzah and Pesach. Even we have the wine. That we have so many mitzvahs revolve around wine, and of course the 4 species on Sukkot, and particularly the esrog. It's a time, especially according to the Hasidic sources, talk about praying for a esrog for Sukkot on Tu B'Shvat. There's a hint which is found in the fact the Mishnah uses the singular term Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan. Tu B'Shvat is literally the Rosh Hashanah for the tree. Not we call it, the popular song Tu B'Shvat is Chag HaIlanot. It's a festival of the trees. But the actual text in the Mishnah says Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan, for the tree. And one explanation of this is that it refers to the esrog tree, the tree which we spend so much time worrying about and making sure that there should be a good esrog. This is certainly something to keep in mind on Tu B'Shvat. The Torah tells us in Parshas Eikev, before the Jewish people are going into the land of Israel, Moshe is describing to them what a special place you're about to enter. What's so special about the land of Israel? And it says, Moshe begins, this is chapter 8, verse 1 in Sefer Devarim. He tells us, the entire commandment that I command you today, you shall observe to perform, so that you may live and increase and come and possess the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers. The goal, we're keeping the Torah mitzvahs that Moshe is instructing us to do, and again, the book of Devarim is all filled with these instructions that Moshe gives over to the Jewish people. Of course, this is particularly appropriate to the month of Shvat, which is the month in which Moshe taught the book of Devarim to the Jewish people. And Moshe's introduction to this, he's telling us the mitzvos that are being given to us are ways in which we are going to inherit the land of Israel, and ways in which we're going to thrive in the land of Israel. And Moshe tells us about how the land of Israel is really a very special and holy place. And we remember, Moshe tells us, you shall remember the entire road on which Hashem led you in the desert. There is this path, this trip through the desert, 40 years, trip through the desert, and it was a teaching experience. It says, Leman anotcha, lenasotcha, ladat asher belvavcha, to understand, to know what is in your heart. What kind of relationship are we going to have with Hashem? That's, of course, in this week's Parsha, Parshat B'Shalach, which is going to be, again, read on Tu B'Shvat, that we find these instances of these tests. The Jewish people go into the desert, they have no food. And Hashem says, if you have faith, I will provide you with the food. There'll be meat at night for you to eat. There'll be bread every day, the man, which falls for 40 years to provide for the Jewish people. The Jewish people complain about water, and Hashem says, I will provide you with water. If you believe that Hashem is in your midst, Hashem will provide for you for all these things. The Midrash tells us a parable to a child who's being carried by his father. The child says, I'm hungry, the father gives him some food. He says, I'm thirsty, he gives him something to drink. Whatever he wants, the child should, of course, recognize that he's getting all these things from his father who is carrying him and taking care of him. Mm-hmm. And the Midrash concludes, it says, if the child would then say, if somebody's walking by says, hey, you know where my father is? I haven't seen him lately. And the father throws the child off. And he says, I'm taking care of you, I'm doing everything for you. And that's why the parsha concludes with the war with Amalek. That the Amalekites came and fought with the Jews, and then the Jews realized that Hashem had been providing for them. They had complained, there's no food, there's no water, there's nothing. Hashem had been taking care of them, and Hashem had been providing for them. And that's the impetus for the war with Amalek is Moshe raises his hands in prayer, and the Jews devote themselves to Hashem. They're not thinking about, we're going to win the war through great military strategy, which they had, and they fought a war, but they did so with prayer and belief that Moshe's prayers and the merit of their belief in Hashem is what was going to help them win this battle. Mm-hmm. And that's the lesson of this travel through the desert, is to understand and come to this realization. And that's also the lesson, again, behind the mitzvahs which the Jewish people are given to observe in the land of Israel. They're going to observe mitzvahs that will teach you how to be aware of Hashem's presence in this world. You're going to have mitzvahs. It says, He afflicted you and let you in hunger. Then He fed you the manna that you did not know, nor did your forefathers know, in order to make you know that not by bread alone does man live, rather by everything that emanates from the mouth of God does man live. That is, it's from Kol Motza Fi Hashem, everything that comes from the mouth of Hashem, that a person lives. And this is the lesson. We come into the land of Israel. For Hashem, it says, Hashem is bringing us into a good land. Eretz Tova, it's a good land. It's a land flowing with streams of water, of springs and underground water coming forth in valley and mountain. And then the famous verse which tells us the 7 species of the land of Israel. A land of wheat, barley, grape, fig, and pomegranate. A land of olive oil, and date honey. And this is where we have the 7 species: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. And after this, you will eat and you will be satisfied, and you will bless Hashem. And this is the source for Birchat HaMazon, the blessing which we say after eating food. And as the Talmud tells us also, we are supposed to make a blessing before eating food, to thank and acknowledge Hashem for the fact that everything which comes from, which we have, comes from Him. The food that we eat is His, and He gave it to us to eat and to acknowledge and to remember. Again, this message, this lesson that what we have comes from Hashem. And we do that through the reciting of blessings. We say in the Kitzur, in chapter 50, it's on page 332 in this edition. So he tells us, it is written, the verse in Psalms, it is written, the earth is Hashem's and the fullness thereof, which implies that everything is like consecrated manner. Everything that we have, all food, substances, they belong to Hashem. And just as it is forbidden to derive benefit from sacred things before they are redeemed, and anyone who derives benefit from sacred things without prior redemption is guilty of misusing sacred property, so too it is forbidden to derive pleasure from this world without first reciting a bracha. The bracha is what we owe Hashem, so to speak, in return for the food. Hashem is giving us the food, but what we need to do for Him, so to speak, is to acknowledge that food comes from Him and to thank Him for giving us that food. And he said, if you enjoyed any food, etc., and before you did, you failed to recite a beracha, it is as though you misused something that is sacred to Hashem. Blessed be His name. And there is no minimum quantity of food over which the blessing before eating must be said. Even if you're only going to taste a little bit of food, no matter how much, you need to say a blessing in order to fulfill the requirement. And then he continues in law number 2, he says, we have a blessing, one of the blessings said over food is the blessing of shehakol. Blessing literally means, blessed are you, Hashem. You say, Shehakol niya bidvaro. Everything exists because you said so. And technically, as a fail-safe, if you say this blessing over any food you eat bread or wine or whatever, anything you eat, Shehakol niya bidvaro, you have fulfilled the obligation. But so then why bother, with all the blessings that we have? Just say every time, Shehakol niya bidvaro, everything comes from you, Hashem. So why not? So he says, although if inadvertently you had already recited the blessing Shehakol over anything, even over bread or wine, you would have fulfilled your obligation. You may not do this deliberately. It is your duty to study in order to know which blessing is appropriate for each kind of individual food. And the reason for that is that by giving a blessing, it says a verse that says in Tehillah, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, that Hashem is blessed every day. And the Gemara expounds, it means every day there's a different blessing. It doesn't say, it says Yom Yom, each day there's a different blessing. Each day there's something different to be thankful to Hashem for. And each type of food that Hashem gave us, these different categories of food that we have, do require different blessings. And the different blessing is a way of thanking Hashem for this individual type of food. And the blessings, of course, in very brief context, first we have the blessing which is said over bread. The blessing is Hamotzi Lachem min haaretz. We thank Hashem who took the bread from the land, brought forth bread from the land. Blessing over wine is Borei Pri Hagafen, who creates the fruit of the vine. Blessing over tree fruits is Borei Pri Ha'etz, who creates the fruit of the tree. Blessing over vegetables or fruits that really grow on vines or in the ground, things that are not going to be annual plants, and you have to keep planting. That would be Borei Pri Ha'adamah, who creates the fruit of the ground. And then again, on everything else, things that don't grow in the ground, things like meat, fish, cheese, eggs, artificial products, that would be the bracha of Shehakol niya bidvaro. That would be the appropriate blessing, and everything comes from Hashem.
So what do you answer a question if someone asks you, Rabbi, I'm traveling a lot and not always I have the opportunity to eat kosher. And sometimes I go to places that are not, and I try to eat only kosher, but sometimes it's not happening. What type of blessing should I make over that food?
So blessings that are said over non-kosher food, there is a discussion about this. There is an opinion that maintains that when someone, there are circumstances, let's say for instance, that a person is permitted to eat non-kosher food, a person's life is in danger, a person is very sick and needs to eat food and there is no kosher food available, a person will be allowed to eat non-kosher food in order to save his life. There is a discussion if even in those circumstances it's appropriate to say a blessing over eating the food. Because at the end of the day, the food is not something that's kosher. I mean, we're not talking about, let's say someone goes and is drinking a glass of water at McDonald's or something like that, something that he's eating kosher food. But someone really going to eat non-kosher food, there is a discussion even when it's permitted to eat that non-kosher food, that really saying a blessing might not be appropriate. And certainly, if someone is not yet all the way there on eating kosher food, try and say blessings when he eats the kosher food, but saying a blessing really on non-kosher food is not an appropriate thing. We're thanking Hashem by saying the blessing is something that we're thanking Hashem for giving us food. When you're eating something that Hashem does not want you to be eating, would not really be an appropriate thing. But the Gemara actually tells us an interesting thing, which the Gemara says that a Jewish person, has innate faith in Hashem. The Gemara says even a robber who's about to commit a robbery, he wants to pray. He prays, Hashem, help me with this robbery, and that is something that people want to do. But obviously, a person should realize it doesn't mean robbery's a good idea. I don't know if there's an official blessing for committing a robbery, but
it's one of the Ten Commandments. You're not supposed to do it.
Perhaps Reish Lakish came up with one.
Actually, the Talmud tells us stories of people who might have been tempted to commit a sin, but when they realized a little thing, you can't make a blessing over food that's not permitted, that even those little things might eventually stop someone or be an inspiration to someone. So, well, why not order the kosher food? Why not get something kosher? Try and get something kosher, and that way you can say a blessing and you can thank Hashem, and that really is the place we want people to be.
So we know.
So he says in number 3, he tells us.
So to pray for the raven.
Pray for the ravens. Yeah.
That always cracks me up. I can't believe God has anything to do with who wins a football game.
He has something to do with everything.
Well, he has something to do with good health.
I don't know if he wants the Ravens turned to someone else. That I can't tell you. But I don't know whose side he's on. But everything. Right. All the people in.
For every winner, there's a loser, right?
Are all the. There's actually an explanation. Is a prayer for the government that's recited. Talks and praises Hashem who makes a path. One of the things we mentioned in prayer, makes a path through the sea. He says there was a rabbi who was once asked, well, what this means. Why is this in the prayer for the government? He said, there are Jews who live in one country and Jews who live in another country. Let's say those two countries go to war with each other. So I don't know. I have the Jews in France praying for the French king to win, and Jews in England praying for the English king to win. Who's going to win? They're fighting with each other. Who's going to win? So he said that's what it means. He makes a path in the sea. He says you have one boat going this way, one boat going the other way. They can both go. You can go. One boat can go east, one boat can go west, and they're both successful. So he says that's what we're praying for. Not you don't have to defeat the other one, but make everyone happy. There's some way, some compromise. So everyone can.
It's about winning, not beating the other guy.
Exactly. Everyone can be a winner in something. Not everyone can win the Super Bowl, but everyone can have something to be successful. We say we're talking about making the blessing is said over the food. In question.
Wait, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay, so you said so let's say blessing of the wine, say motzi, and then if you're having vegetables,
right,
you're supposed to say an individual blessing.
If you're in the middle of a meal that contains bread. So if you
wash, that kind of covered it.
So if you have a meal that contains bread, this is basically what it works. If you have a meal that contains bread, we consider bread to be the staple food of a meal. So anything which goes then into the category of the main component of the meal would be exempt. So I don't know, the vegetable, the meat, potatoes, whatever. But something that's like a dessert. I still haven't said Birchat Hamazon, I haven't benched yet, so I'm still technically in a meal. But dessert is not really part of a meal function.
If you're having a fruit,
especially if you weren't expecting it, like if you get a fruit salad or something, you could actually say 2 brachot over that.
But even if you weren't expecting it, then let's say you have like a fruit tart, it's almost like a separate thing.
So that's a separate thing. So then fruit is going to be something, you don't really eat fruit as part of a meal. Maybe make chicken l'orange or something like that. But normally you don't eat fruit. That's not a meal food. That's a dessert. So that would be something that would still need to make. You need to make it then a brei pri ha'etz, a brei pri ha'adama on the food. Wine also is an exception. If you drink wine, even during let's say on Shabbat, you're going to drink wine. You make kiddush before the meal. But let's say weekday, or something not making kiddush, but during the meal you decide to have a glass of wine. So even if you washed, wine is an exception. You wouldn't need to make a brei pri hagafen on wine, even during a bread meal. Because wine itself is something that is a special food, just like bread is special. So in other words, let's say I sit down, wash my hands, having pizza over here. Just regular day, and then I decide I like a glass of orange juice. You don't make a blessing on that. The drink is part of the meal. But if I wanted to drink wine, specifically wine you would have to say another blessing on. You would have to say brei pri hagafen on the wine itself.
You always say
because wine is a special drink. It's something special. It's
used for making kiddush. It's used for sanctification purposes. So therefore, it should be.
That's why it's special.
That's why it's special.
And why it has to be kosher and that kind of stuff.
In a regular meal, whatever, sitting having a regular meal, didn't make kiddush beforehand, so it's not Shabbos something. So we'd have to then make a Brei Pri Hagafen on wine. So that's one exception. Again, something that's eaten like as a dessert type food would also be an exception. But other staple parts of the meal, the meat, the fish, the side dishes, those things, main part of the meal, that's going to be exempt if I made a blessing on the bread. And of course, if I didn't make a blessing on the bread, you'd have to make a blessing on each.
What about making like shakol on like a cup of coffee after a meal or something like that? If it's before
drinks, generally speaking, are exempt. Drinks are considered always have a meal function. Even if you're drinking a sweet drink or something like that, part of the function of a drink is to help digest the food that you've eaten, help get the food down, and that's always drinking we consider to be part of the meal, and therefore it's going to be exempt with hamotzi. Again, with the exception of wine. Wine by itself. Also, as a separate thing, if someone is sitting and drinking many types of beverages, and drinks wine, you're not just having like a cocktail hour, you're having a lot of drinks. So if you do drink wine and you make a blessing, Brei Pri Hagafen, you do not need to make a blessing on any of the other drinks that you're going to consume.
You don't have to do shakol.
So I'm having some wine and beer and coffee and whatever, you make a blessing on the wine, Brei Pri Hagafen, that will exempt the other drinks that you have to consume. This could happen at a kiddush. Let's say you make kiddush, and then you're going to have some soda with the food. You don't have to make a shakol on it, so you make blessing on the wine.
And make some other liquor during the meal after the fish. They take another.
Yeah, again, so that you're not going to have to make a blessing.
It's time to drink liquor.
That's right, aperitif.
So
he's drinking liquor? No.
One of the other things which you talk about in terms of blessings are mentioned before the 7 species from Israel. So there are when you have many types of fruit that are going to be available to eat during a meal, and you need to make a blessing of Brei Pri Ha'etz on one of these fruits. So a species, one of the species from Israel, doesn't have to have grown in Israel, but one of these 7 species is going to be always the preferred thing to make the blessing Brei Pri Ha'etz on that species. On that thing, because these are the special ones. These are the ones that are mentioned in the Torah as being the great fruits that Israel is producing. That these are special fruits.
And the same thing for wine. If you have Israeli wine,
it doesn't actually have to come from Israel. These species are important because the Torah says
you're talking
these
about
are special species. These are special things,
like grapes and olives.
Yes, exactly. So there are people who like to have
grapes, olives, figs, dates,
and grapes, olives, figs, dates, pomegranates.
Pomegranates, those are the 5. Okay.
So now there's an order.
But what about also though specifically, because I know you said those would have preference if you had a mix of fruits that you would say the bracha over. Now what about if you had a couple different wines and you're making kiddush? Was there preference to use the Israeli wine? Or
there's not particularly a preference to it because it comes from Israel. The preference is that these are special fruits.
I understand.
For which Israel is good. So you can make kiddush on whatever wine. Probably would make kiddush on the best wine that you whether or not that's from Israel.
But if you had a bottle of Israeli and a bottle of non-Israeli
that
wine,
wouldn't be a preference.
You'd pick the better one.
You pick the better one for kiddush. We always would like to use the best wine for kiddush. The order that the fruits are mentioned in the pasuk is the order in which of their importance. It's actually interesting. The pasuk repeats the word eretz twice. So it starts off telling it's eretz chitos ora v'gefen u'tein avriman. It's a land that produces wheat and barley and grapes and figs and pomegranates. And then it says again, eretz zeit shemen udvash. It's a land that produces olives with oil and that produces honey. So therefore we actually say we intersperse the 2 last mentioned species, since the word eretz is repeated, like you're starting the list over again. Those actually end up going beforehand. So the actual order of preference would be you start with chitim, that's the first one mentioned, wheat. Then you skip to the end, because again we started the list again in the last 2. So then olives. Then you would go to barley, and then you again skip to the end and do honey. Now wheat and barley are different. Wheat and barley are not fruits; they're grains. So actually, the order ends up being olives, dates, grapes, figs, and pomegranates. That would be the order of preference if you have a bunch of fruit that's out there to eat. kind of backwards. But there is an order. They used to do when people would come for rabbinic tests. So one of the things that the rabbi who was testing them would do sometimes is they would put out a nice meal for them, and okay, now which blessing do you make first?
See how they make the brachot.
Let's see how if you can do this. This fruit over here and that type of cake and this how okay here enjoy
and do it in the right order so that you can maximize the number of blessings that you say and so forth.
Yeah, that's part of the test. But yeah, it's a
catch-all.
Well, that's right, because Adamah covers.
There's a story that's told about a great rabbi, Rabbi Aharon Saltzman. There's a great rabbi in Europe, and when he was a young man, he was a poor man, and he was proposed a shidduch with a very wealthy girl. He was a big, already up-and-coming Torah scholar, and he came to have dinner at his prospective in-laws' house. They bring out coffee service. He never saw coffee before. So trying to figure out, testing what kind of blessing. So he takes the coffee grounds and pours some sugar over them and says the blessing on the sugar and eats it. He had no idea what they're doing with it. He never saw this. And the girl said, I can't marry you. It's like, it's not to drink coffee. So the story goes, this father-in-law, he one time he visits the rabbi of his town and he says, what are you working on, Rabbi? He says, I'm writing correspondence with this great Rabbi Meshulam Igra. He's a great, the guy faints. I could have had him for his son-in-law. He wakes up and he tells him the story, and the rabbi said, you could have had him for your son-in-law, and you turned him down because he didn't know how to drink coffee. He faint again. Faint again. But this was a test. This is something they would do. They would do to make sure what's fine with the different blessings. But that is one of the things which we do on Tu B'Shvat is again to have these fruits and to remember about the specialness. Some people do try to get fruits from Israel. That is something that people try to do. Of course, having the fruit from Israel is a very special thing. There were great Hasidic rabbis who would be very upset if people would criticize the food from Israel. They would serve food from Israel. And people say, that doesn't taste so good. They didn't like it. There were some rabbis who wouldn't serve food from Israel at their table because they didn't want to hear people say, that's not such a great apple. If the apple that comes from Israel is that's got to be a great apple. It comes from Israel. It's got to be great.
By definition.
Great thing by definition, yeah. And that is also part of the Tu B'Shvat experience. Another thing which some people like to try and do on Tu B'Shvat is to make a shachianu on a new fruit. Mm-hmm. So a new fruit has got to be a seasonal fruit. A lot of times it's hard to find a seasonal fruit, especially in modern supermarkets that have, there are oranges in the supermarket all year round. But occasionally you will find something that has not been in the stores and now is in the store. Another thing which is important to note with regard to shachianu is you cannot make shachianu on a dried fruit. It has to be a fresh. The whole point of shachianu is to say we're saying shachianu over we're thankful to Hashem for giving us the new crop, so it's got to be a new fruit. Take a dried fruit, a dried apple from who knows when, that's not going to be a shachianu thing. This is one of the reasons why it appears that they became accustomed to make a shachianu on new carob. Carob, it's dry, but it's naturally dry. That's how it grows.
Right.
Of course, there are people who don't like carob very much, and if you really don't like it, it's probably not something to make a shachianu on. But there are people who like it. There are people who have adopted it as a part of the custom of Tu B'Shvat having carob. This is one of the benefits of that. If you do like carob, you can make a shachianu on that, and it's also a fruit that is.
It's how do you call it, carob?
It's a kind of a long, thin, brown fruit It's hard usually.
Very healthy.
Leathery, hard, tough thing.
Was it
It has seeds.
K-A-R-O-B.
C-A-R-O-B.
Yeah, is it C, not K?
C.
Okay.
I think they use it. People into to health food, they use it as a chocolate substitute.
Yeah, it's a very good Parv chocolate substitute. So you see it a lot of Parv chocolate. You'll see carob as Parv chocolate.
I'll ask him that.
And yeah, they'll know about it at some place like Whole Foods. And this is a traditional food. And carob, the Talmud talks a lot about carob. Says it's a fruit that grows in Israel. It's a hardy fruit. You'll see when you encounter a carob, it's a hardy fruit. And the Talmud tells us, for instance, that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hid in a cave for 13 years to avoid the Romans who had persecuted him for studying Torah. Again, they would eat carob fruit. That's what sustained him. And it tells us the great sage Rabbi Hanina Bardosa. He was a very poor man he devoted his life to Torah study, and he would really, except for Shabbos, live on carobs, fruit. He was very poor man. The Talmud tells us stories of his great piety, despite the fact that he was so poor. At one time they didn't have oil to light. It says they put vinegar in the I don't know if you can like carrot. they lit vinegar. They put vinegar by mistake in the oil in the lamps. They didn't have oil. They didn't have it, but he prayed to Hashem. He said, if Hashem lets oil burn, Hashem can let vinegar burn also, and it burned all Shabbos long. There's a picture for carob.
A picture of a carob.
Oh, I've seen that.
You want to show it? You can put it on the camera if you want.
There you go. Yep.
Oops.
Yep.
Carob.
There you go, carob. Yep.
Okay, so that's a carob.
Yep. So we get.
And you got a good look at the carob.
That's right.
For some reason, we also have wheat and barley are species from Israel. There are some people who would try to eat. We have wheat bread. There are some rabbis that they would bring beer. Beer is made with barley. So they get some barley product on.
I just thought of something. My favorite beer is actually wheat beer.
Wheat beer. So you can. So that could be the wheat.
Yeah, it's like you have wheat beer, and then you have regular other beer.
So you can do a taste test. But if you're having wine, you don't need to make a bracha on it. Make a bracha on the wine, and then you can go ahead with the beers. There actually is a discussion. We make the blessing which we make on beer is not reflect the fact that it's a grain. The blessing we make on beer, we make a blessing of shahakol. Yeah, because it's a beverage. Again, even though it ultimately comes from wheat, that's not the best thing you can do with wheat. The best thing you can do with wheat is make bread out of it. That's the function.
You don't
function
try buttering
of wheat.
your beer.
No, I mean you can. I don't know. You do a lot of things with beer, but that is basically. And then after eating from these seven species from Israel. There's a special after blessing. It's also when they're not eaten during the course of the meal. We're familiar with the blessing of al hamichya. We eat after grain product, after cakes, after pasta, pretzels. A meal that doesn't involve grain products that are not baked into bread. This is a abridgment of Birchat Hamazon into one blessing. Find it in the Siddur.
The short beer cut was on.
So no, this is not the short beer cut. This is a special blessing. It's on page 200. You can see over here on page 200 in the Siddur that it tells us this is a special blessing. It was composed for things like cakes, pasta, some meal that's eaten a grain product that's not going to have been made out of into bread, and that's also said for wine, and also said for these 5 fruit species. And then you see they give you choices at the top, which one to say if you're eating after grain products, after wine, or after fruit. And this is different. There is such a thing, a shortened version of Birchat Hamazon, which can be said after bread, but that's still going to have 4 distinct blessings, just condensed into a shorter version. This is one blessing, and this contains the whole it mentions the different themes of the blessings. So we mentioned Al HaMichya or Al HaEitz. We mentioned the thank Hashem for the food that He gave us. We thank Hashem for the Eretz Chemda Tova Rechava, the land. We ask Hashem for mercy on Yisrael Amecha, on Yisrael Mirecha, on Israel and on Jerusalem. Again, we hit on the themes of the blessings. We mentioned the holidays. That would be the Ritzei or the Yom V'Yavo, mentioning if it's a Shabbos or holiday. And then we say again, Ki Ata Hashem Tovu Meitiv Lakol. We thank Hashem for being good and doing good, which is the fourth blessing. So we kind of hit the themes of each of the blessings, but it's condensed into one blessing. And that's also in recognition of the specialness of these species that the land of Israel is blessed with. So have a good Shabbos and a happy Tu B'Shvat, Shana Tova Mesuka for all of us and all of the Jewish people.
We're at the bank. Thank you.